Hello, Muslim friends in the world. That morning, the skies over Moscow were gray, as if nature itself sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. The main roads leading to the Kremlin were under heavy guard. Rows of black-clad soldiers stood alert, weapons at the ready. The world's media had gathered in the Kremlin courtyard since dawn, their eyes fixed on a single point, the deep maroon podium erected overnight. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, Russia's iron-fisted leader for more than 2 decades, was about to deliver a sudden emergency address. No leaks, no hints. The entire world held its breath. At exactly 10 a.m., the massive doors of the Kremlin opened. Putin emerged with his signature composed expression, though his eyes carried an intensity sharper than usual. He wore a dark suit with no tie, and on his chest hung a symbol previously unseen on him, a golden crescent moon pendant. His steps were slow, deliberate, and when he stood behind the podium, the world seemed to freeze. People of Russia and all of humanity. His deep voice echoed, broadcast live to over 190 countries. Today, I do not speak as the president of the Russian Federation. I speak as a man who has seen darkness and found the light. A pause, camera lenses zoomed in on nervous journalists furiously typing. For years, we've been trapped in misguided pursuits. Power, conflict, moral decay. But in my search for truth, I found peace in one teaching. Putin bowed his head briefly, then looked directly into the main camera. Islam. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. The world stopped spinning. I hereby declare that Russia will begin its transition into a nation guided by the spiritual foundations of Islam. This is not a betrayal of our past, it is the salvation of our future. From a nearby press building, an American journalist dropped her coffee cup. Outside the Kremlin, crowds began to gather around massive public screens, some stunned, some furious, others overwhelmed with emotion. And as a symbol of this journey, our iconic churches will be repurposed as houses of worship for Muslims. The house of God belongs to all mankind. No one loses, everyone finds a new home. CNN and BBC correspondents exchanged panicked whispers. Within 5 minutes, the hashtag #, Putin Goes Islam, was trending worldwide. Stock markets shook. Emergency hotlines rang in the Pentagon, the Vatican, and Riyadh, simultaneously. Putin ended his 18-minute speech with a phrase he had never uttered publicly, Allahu Akbar. He bowed his head, then turned and walked away, taking no questions. Above Moscow, the gray skies began to drizzle. Light rain kissed the Kremlin's domes, and beneath the chill, the world realized one truth. History had shifted, and there would be no turning back. Putin's speech shook the world, but its greatest shockwave was felt within Russia itself. The very next day, the Kremlin issued an official document, stamped in gold with the emblem of the Russian Federation. Its title stunned the nation, Decree 0415, Russia's Spiritual Renaissance. It wasn't just a declaration, it was a blueprint for transformation. Key points included the formation of the National Sharia Council of Russia, a constitutional amendment to include Islamic spiritual values as moral guidance, replacement of national holidays with Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, plans to convert 34 historic churches into mosques within 3 months, a phased alcohol ban across major cities. The government moved swiftly, too swiftly. In Kazan, Islamic flags, green, red, and adorned with Arabic calligraphy, waved atop government buildings. Cities like Dagestan and Chechnya celebrated with fireworks, chants of Allahu Akbar, and public prayers. But in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Novosibirsk, the mood was grim. Non-Muslim citizens took to the streets, many holding crosses and candles, silently standing guard outside churches rumored to be repurposed. The Orthodox Church, long a pillar of Russian identity, began speaking out, not against Islam, but against the erasure of Christian heritage. Is this reform or a revolution masked in faith? Patriarch Kirill, addressing a sea of believers outside St. Basil's Cathedral. Behind closed doors, old politicians and high-ranking generals, once loyal to Putin, began to murmur. Secret meetings unfolded in countryside villas. Scenarios of restoring the true identity of Russia were discussed, some peaceful, others not. The FSB, Russia's intelligence agency, caught wind of the brewing unrest. Within 2 weeks, 14 key opposition figures were detained for anti-state conspiracy. Online, mysterious groups emerged with coded names: White Snow, Keepers of the Cross, True Russia. They released short videos calling for a return to Russian roots, rejecting what they labeled as cultural Arabization. Historical buildings were quickly fenced off. Renovation scaffolding went up. Outside the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, a new sign appeared: Spiritual Architecture Renewal Project, Moscow Grand Mosque, 2025. Architects from Istanbul, Abu Dhabi, and Jakarta flew in. Their vision? A grand mosque that blended Russian domes with Middle Eastern minarets. The media dubbed it the new soul of Russia. Then it happened. The first call to prayer echoed through Red Square. Broadcast from emergency-mounted speakers, the Adhan touched the hearts of millions of Russian Muslims. But to others, it was a declaration of conquest, not peace. Inside the Kremlin, Putin sat in silence, staring out at the Moskva River. On his desk lay 2 objects: a Russian translation of the Quran, a small portrait of Tsar Nicholas II, 2 histories, 2 paths. In a private meeting with his advisors, he spoke slowly, but with certainty. Russia no longer looks west. We look inward, and to the east. The world watched, breathless. Was this the birth of a new civilization, or the beginning of civil conflict in the land of the Red Bear? It didn't take long. Within 72 hours of Putin's shocking declaration, the ripple effects shook every corner of the globe. Economics, politics, religion, all thrown into chaos. The financial markets, crashing, global diplomacy, frozen, the Muslim world, jubilant, the West, panicked and threatened. On Monday morning, just 3 days after Putin's speech, the Moscow Stock Exchange surged by 28%, driven by an unexpected wave of capital from the Middle East. Qatar and the UAE pledged billions for Russia's new infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, in the West, things fell apart. Dow Jones and FTSE nosedived. The euro wavered, and for the first time in 2 decades, the Russian ruble strengthened against the US dollar. We're not witnessing war, we're witnessing a global spiritual migration, said one economist in The Guardian. Putin's move sparked a geopolitical avalanche. Suddenly, Russia was flooded with calls of support from Turkey's president, offering joint Islamic defense development, Qatar's emir, pledging to build 1,000 new mosques across Russia, Iran and Pakistan, inviting Russia into a new green bloc, a pan-Islamic economic alliance, Indonesia and Malaysia expressing readiness to strengthen spiritual diplomacy with Moscow. In response, NATO convened an emergency summit. The US president spoke with sharp concern. We are witnessing a transformation that could dismantle the post-Webber global order. In Rome, Pope Francis II held a global prayer mass, calling for spiritual protection of sacred sites. His message was gentle yet pointed. We do not oppose Islam, but we will not stand idle while churches become what they were never meant to be. Orthodox and Catholic protests erupted across Eastern Europe. Silent masses stood facing east, toward Russia, holding candles and crosses. In contrast, in cities like Jakarta, Cairo, Islamabad, and Istanbul, millions of Muslims took to the streets chanting, "Putin, Mujahid of the era." The internet exploded. TikTok, YouTube, and X, formerly Twitter, overflowed with videos under the tag number Islamic Russia, ranging from spiritual awakenings to conspiracies and geopolitical analyses. One video went viral. Russian military helicopters dropping prayer rugs over Moscow, while the Adhan played through drone speakers. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Equal parts awe, fear, and fury. Western media outlets aired dramatic specials. The fall of Eastern Christendom? Putin's final gambit. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera and TRT World responded, Russia finds its soul again. NATO forces in Eastern Europe entered high alert. Latvia, Estonia, and Poland increased air patrols. The US deployed 2 aircraft carriers to the Baltic Sea. Putin fired back. Thousands of Russian troops mobilized near Ukraine once more. Joint military drills with Iran began in the Caspian Sea. Meanwhile, whispers of nuclear repositioning leaked from unnamed sources. The world stared at its reflection and saw the shadow of Cold War reborn. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't just ideology, but faith. Inside the Kremlin, Putin remained calm. He sat in his private study, listening to a Moroccan Qari recite Surah Al-Fath. The river outside was still, the world outside, anything but. On his desk were 3 documents: a classified report on rising domestic unrest, a proposal for a new Islamic Defense League, a short note from an unknown sender. "Be careful with fire, Vladimir. Even holy fire burns." His advisor approached, whispering, "The Vatican has called for talks. NATO has not responded. Salib Hitam is gaining ground." Putin simply nodded, eyes sharp. "Let them come." A new world cannot be born without labor pains. Moscow's skyline had been forever changed. The Kremlin Mosque, designed to be the spiritual heart of Putin's new Russia, rose like a modern-day monument of transformation. But for many, it symbolized division, not unity. The foundations of this ambitious project were built from the pain of a fractured country. Inside the Golden Dome structure, workers from Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan toiled, while outside millions of Russians debated, protested, and feared the dawn of a new era. Moscow was divided. In the heart of the city, the new mosque was rapidly becoming a beacon of controversy. Its 5 towering minarets, glistening in the sun, cast a long shadow over Red Square. The Golden Dome, designed to be a symbol of spiritual rebirth, stood in stark contrast to the traditional Orthodox churches surrounding it. At night, the mosque's lights bathed the city in an eerie glow. In the distance, the silhouettes of St. Basil's Cathedral and Christ the Savior Cathedral loomed, now standing guard over a changing world. But the reactions were not what Putin had hoped. Despite Putin's careful orchestration, the country's deep-rooted divisions were impossible to ignore. From the moment the Kremlin Mosque's construction began, a silent but powerful resistance started to grow. In the dark alleys of Moscow and the industrial suburbs, whispers of a movement called Salib Hitam, Black Cross, began to spread like wildfire. The group, initially thought to be an underground network of radical Orthodox Christians, soon revealed itself to be something far more dangerous: a well-organized, covert insurgency. They were not just fighting the mosque, they were fighting what they saw as the erasure of Russian identity. "This is not about Islam," said one resistance leader, interviewed anonymously on a pirate radio station. "This is about Russia's soul. We are defending the spirit of our ancestors. We will not allow our churches to become prayer halls for invaders." Members of Salib Hitam operated in shadows, tearing down mosque construction signs, sabotaging Russian military supply lines, and assassinating local officials who were seen as traitors to Russia's Christian legacy. But they were not alone in their fury. As tensions reached their peak, cracks appeared within the very corridors of power. Putin's inner circle was no longer united. In a secret meeting with his top advisors, Putin was confronted by General Valentin Sokolov, a decorated war hero and former ally, who now expressed growing doubts. "You have underestimated the power of the people, Vladimir," Sokolov warned. "You've sacrificed too much of Russia's past for a fleeting vision of the future." Putin's eyes narrowed, but he remained calm. "I did what was necessary. The people will come to understand." But Sokolov was not convinced. "What you've done is not renewal. It's destruction. I fear this country is too far gone." Sokolov wasn't alone in his thoughts. Many top officials, including several influential members of the Russian Orthodox Church, began to demand that Putin abandon his policies or face the collapse of the state. Behind closed doors, some whispered that Putin was no longer in control, that the machine was taking over. As the protests grew louder, the Russian people found themselves at a crossroads. In St. Petersburg, thousands of Orthodox Christians gathered outside the historic Smolny Cathedral, chanting prayers and demanding the restoration of the old Russia. The crowd was met by armed Russian police who were ordered to disperse them. But the crowd stood firm, clashing with the authorities. At the same time, in the Caucasus, former warlords, many of whom had been Putin's allies in the past, began to rise against the regime. They had once fought in Chechnya and Georgia, but now they took up arms in the name of defending Russia's soul. A series of violent skirmishes erupted in the countryside, where militias loyal to Salib Hitam engaged Russian forces. The violence spread quickly, and the Russian government struggled to maintain control of its vast borders. The construction of the Kremlin mosque continued unabated, even as the country teetered on the brink of civil war. Yet the mosque, once seen as a symbol of Putin's grand vision, now stood as a reminder of a divided nation. In Kazan, a city with a large Muslim population, the mosque was hailed as a victory. But in Moscow, it became a target for both Orthodox radicals and neo-nationalist groups, who viewed it as the final insult to Russia's heritage. A clash between police and protesters broke out in Red Square. Images of Russian flags being torn down, replaced with green banners of Islam, flooded the internet. A clandestine video surfaced showing a high-ranking FSB official stating, "We are teetering on the edge of total collapse. We've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." Back in the Kremlin, Putin's resolve began to waver. His once unshakable confidence had turned to uncertainty. The resistance had become too powerful, and the people's anger could no longer be ignored. The final decision would come at a cost. Should he double down on his vision of a new Russia, or would he heed the calls of those who begged for him to restore the country to its roots? Putin knew that the world was watching. A single misstep could lead to the fall of his regime, or worse, the unraveling of Russia itself. The world stood on the brink. Russia, once a proud empire that spanned continents, now faced its most dangerous hour. A nation divided, fractured not just by its politics, but by its soul. The decision that would be made in the coming days would determine if the country would collapse in flames or emerge as a new world order. Moscow had become a city at war with itself. The streets that were once filled with tourists, businessmen, and ordinary Russians had transformed into battlegrounds. The sound of gunfire, protests, and the distant thrum of military vehicles reverberated through the once stalwart capital. Within the Kremlin, Putin's inner circle was disintegrating. The military and intelligence services were divided, some loyal to the president, others ready to revolt against his grand vision. Outside, the Russian Orthodox Church had organized mass rallies, with Patriarch Kirill leading the charge against the Islamification of Russia. Inside the parliament, legislators who once supported Putin were now calling for his resignation. But the Kremlin mosque, looming in the distance, continued to rise. The Salib Hitam resistance had spread from Moscow to the vast stretches of Siberia. It wasn't just an ideological movement anymore. It was a full-blown civil war. In the remote mountains of the Caucasus, militias loyal to Salib Hitam launched surprise attacks on Russian military bases, seizing control of entire regions. The government's forces, stretched thin by the unrest, were unable to keep up. The rebellion wasn't only about religion, it was about identity. People who had once believed in Putin's vision of a resurgent Russia now took up arms, believing they were fighting for their heritage, for a Russia that no longer existed. At the same time, Putin's most loyal soldiers were growing desperate. The resistance was too strong, and the support from ordinary Russians was crumbling. Putin, ever the strategist, had anticipated many of the problems he faced. But as the walls closed in around him, even he began to question the path he had chosen. He sat alone in the presidential suite of the Kremlin, looking out over the city that was no longer his to command. On his desk lay 3 items: a Russian flag that once symbolized unity, a Quran, a gift from his allies in the Middle East, the portrait of Tsar Nicholas II, the last ruler of Russia. He had spent decades building a legacy, a vision of a new Russian empire, one that embraced the spirit of Islam. But the cost had been higher than anyone could have predicted. "Have I made a grave mistake?" he whispered to himself, staring at the flag. The question hung in the air. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His closest advisor, Sergei, entered the room. His face was pale. "Vladimir Vladimirovich, the people are no longer with us," Sergei said gravely. "There's word of a full military coup. They're coming for you." That night, Putin made his final speech, one that would determine his fate and Russia's future. The world's media had already gathered in the Kremlin's Grand Hall, but this time Putin was not his usual self. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no confident smirk. He appeared tired, almost as if he had aged a decade in the past few weeks. "People of Russia," he began. His voice was steady, but the weight of the moment hung in the air. "I have led this country through times of conflict, through times of victory, but I have also made choices that have led us to the edge of destruction." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, some filled with fear, others with anger. "This is not just about Islam or Christianity. This is about Russia's soul, and it is now up to the people of Russia to decide what that soul will be." There was a long silence as Putin's words sank in. The decision was no longer his. It was now up to the people and the future of the nation. "I have always believed in the strength of Russia," he continued, "but I fear we have lost our way. My vision for this country was built on hope, but perhaps it was an illusion, and now I must pay the price for that." As Putin delivered his speech, the streets outside were filled with chaos. Protests, riots, and military skirmishes engulfed Moscow. The Salib Haidam forces had finally made their move, attacking key government facilities, including the Kremlin itself. But as the tanks rolled into the heart of the city, a strange thing happened. The people of Moscow, both Muslim and Christian, united. The line between resistance and loyalty blurred. Ordinary citizens, once divided by their faiths, stood together to protect their homeland, regardless of the flags they carried. "We are Russians first," one protester shouted, holding both a cross and a crescent high. As the final battle raged in the streets, Putin faced the ultimate decision. Would he fight to the bitter end, or would he relinquish his power and allow Russia to choose its future? Across the globe, nations held their breath. NATO, the Middle East, Europe, and the United States all anxiously awaited Russia's next move. The world was waiting for one thing: the end of this brutal struggle. In the distance, the sound of airstrikes echoed, but so did the chants of unity. Russia was on the brink of a new dawn, one that would either rebuild or shatter the country beyond recognition. As dawn broke over Moscow, the smoke of battle cleared. The Kremlin was no longer under siege, but it was a shattered shell of its former self. The outcome? Unclear. The question remained: was this the beginning of a new Russia, a place where people of all faiths could live together in peace? Or was it the end of Putin's dream of a new empire, and the end of the Russian Federation as we knew it? The last stand had been made. Russia's future was now uncertain. Whether the country would emerge from the ashes as a united and peaceful nation, or if it would continue to tear itself apart, remained to be seen. One thing was for certain: the world would never be the same again.